Targeting American Rescue Plan funds to early care and education. I'm going to start the slideshow. And there we go. You should be able to see the screen. I'm Lori Connors-Tadros with the National Institute for Early Education Research. And I'm joined by Mandy Sorgi, who is the Executive Director of the National Association of Early Childhood Specialists in State Departments of Education, and Ralph Grafwellner, who leads the early childhood work for the Council of Chief State School Officers. We're really pleased that you were able to join us this morning or afternoon, wherever you are from. Let me just see. Okay. Should have checked this out. How do I move? Okay, there we go. Mandy, Rolf, and I have worked together to promote policy continuity for birth through third grade for a number of years. And with the unprecedented opportunity of the federal relief funds to strengthen the early care and education system, we wanted to increase state leaders' knowledge and understanding of the elementary and secondary emergency relief dollars, in particular to address the learning needs of young children. There had been quite a bit of information that was going out about the various child care funds, and because elementary and secondary relief funds cover such a broad spectrum, less specific focus on early childhood. So that drove us to particularly to write the brief that we're going to share a little bit about, and also then to share this webinar. In the meantime, others from the Erickson Institute and others also developed some briefs. And so the goals for our webinar today is to share with you resources to inform the policy in your states, to spur new thinking on how to target the federal relief funds from various agencies, but most importantly, thinking in a somewhat aligned, coordinated, leveraged way, the funds from childcare and education for young children birth through third grade. We know that this segment of the population have been inordinately impacted by the pandemic, both in their learning and health and family situation. We hope that with this information, you will have some new ideas to take to colleagues in your own state and to consider how to align and leverage federal relief dollars to collectively strengthen the early care and education system. So really, really pleased to welcome our presenters, Richard Lauer, who is the Director of Preschool and Out of School Time Learning for the Office of Grade Start in the Michigan Department of Education. Richard is responsible for the administration of the state's publicly funded preschool program, the Great Start Readiness Program, and the after-school program, the 21st Century Community Learning Centers. In addition, he supports the department's efforts around summer learning, as well as early childhood and out-of-school time workforce initiatives. Prior to joining the department in 2008, Richard served as the executive director of the Michigan Head Start Association, and he's also worked in the nonprofit sector focused on children, youth, and program development. So he has a very deep experience in early care and education. We're very pleased to welcome Jacqueline Vasquez, who is the director of the Early Development Instrument at the Erickson Institute. And she also leads Erickson Institute's Policy and Leadership Development Department. During her time at Erickson, she launched the EDI project to provide neighborhood level data to communities throughout Illinois. Under Jacqueline's leadership, her team launched an interactive website for communities to have greater access to resources and data. Jacqueline serves as a coach for the Early Childhood Leadership Academy at Erickson Institute, effectively supporting Illinois leaders in deepening their knowledge around early childhood policy development using a racial equity lens. We're very pleased to have Miriam Calderon, the newly appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary, the Office of Early Learning at the U.S. Department of Education. Miriam was appointed by Governor Kate Brown in 2017 to serve as the Early Learning Systems Director for the state of Oregon. He previously served in the Obama-Biden administration advising on early learning policy at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Domestic Policy Council. Miriam has a diverse set of experiences in the early childhood field. She's worked at the Bainham Family Foundation. She's served as the Director of Early Childhood Education at the District of Columbia and was an Associate Director for Education Policy at the National Council of La Raza. We really are very pleased to have Miriam here. We're really pleased to be able to support her. It's kind of a one-man show right now at the department. And so we're looking forward to hearing from each of our speakers. I'm going to turn it over to Jacqueline, and she will begin, highlights of the publication on using ESSA funds for early childhood. In the meantime, I just want to share to please use your chat box if you need to communicate with us. Oh, good, Mandy did this already. And then you can use Q&A. I don't know if, and I will apologize, this is the first time I ever did a webinar. So you're all muted, but I can unmute you in a minute, as soon as I figure that out. Because we are very happy to have you pipe up and speak. And I'll figure that out, but let me turn that over to Jacqueline. And again, we're really looking forward to learning, listening, and hearing from you as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lori, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Jacqueline Vasquez. I am the Director of the Early Development Instrument at Erickson Institute's Policy and Leadership Department. And this is a document, this guidance document that you see on your screen here. I'll go ahead and add that to the chat in a moment. But this guidance document was developed by a writing team that included myself, Daniel Ewan of the Education Council, Kristen Emanuel of Start Early, formerly of the Ounce of Prevention, and Elliot Regenstein of Foresight Law and Policy, with additional contributions from Lisa Hood at the Center for Study of Education Policy at Illinois State University. We also had a stakeholder meeting on this subject that was convened and included early childhood advocates from across Illinois. Originally, this document, though, was focused on Illinois, and an earlier version of this report was approved by the Illinois Early Learning Council's Executive Committee in March of 2017. During the coronavirus pandemic, children across the country had to adjust to a new approach to schooling, and for our youngest learners, especially those in pre-K, kindergarten, and early elementary, this has limited their access to developmentally appropriate relationship-based educational opportunities. And research has shown us that pre-K and kindergarten enrollment dropped significantly during the pandemic. So what I'm about to share with you are some highlights from this report, and specifically thinking about how schools could and states can use this guidance to help guide your investing to support young children, as well as their families, teachers, and other professionals. And while this guidance is meant to be useful throughout ESSA's remaining life, it's being published right now at a time when school districts and states are receiving substantial federal funding for the COVID-19 relief. So part of what you'll see when you enter this guide is it's organized by type of activity. So expand access to early learning, enhance the quality of service, building professional capacity, supporting English learners, improve transitions to kindergarten, engage families, expand curricular activities, instructional materials, and you'll have, hopefully you'll take time to check this out. It has a lot of really great strategies to support. Next slide, please, Lori.
Okay.
Thank you. So on page 8 of this guidance document, ESSA funds, including Title I, II, III, and IV, along with relief funding, can support transition strategies that help parents prepare for the elementary experience and set expectations for school supports. Transitions to kindergarten strategies are so important because short-term funds can establish sustainable infrastructure for transitions. In addition to professional development for teachers and other school staff to help them effectively work with families during transition, activities to improve transitions can be supported by these funds by many different ways. I'm going to highlight just a couple that you can find in the report. So establishing a transition planning team that meets year-round, including community members, families with lived experience, school-based educators, the early childhood providers, community-based, early intervention staff, and all others that throughout your community to implement a strategy for transitioning all children into early elementary. Developing or identifying needs assessments, also inviting families and school staff to participate in focus groups to help guide decisions, providing summer learning sessions to mitigate summer learning loss and introduce children and families to the school, teachers, staff, routines, expectations, translate all materials into language spoken for families in the community, and not just translating, but really being innovative in outreach and marketing. Establishing data sharing protocols so that schools have information on what children know and are able to do, as well as developing coordinated data systems that share student information between grade levels and across districts. Data systems can be aligned with those of early learning providers in the area as well, with the appropriate legal and technological safeguards in place. Next slide, Lori, please.
Okay.
Thank you. On page 14 of the guide, we talk about building the professional capacity of your team, which is another strategy that one-time funding can go towards very successfully. Professional development can be a powerful lever for creating high-quality instructional environments for children in early childhood programs. The strengthening of organizations in this way can be accomplished through the use of job-embedded professional development, which is characterized by the use of routines of collaboration and encourage shared learning, reflection. There's a lot of other strategies that can include, as we just discussed, transition practices, the identification and support for children with special needs, strategies to minimize suspensions and expulsions, culturally sensitive and differentiated parent and family engagement and empowerment strategies and best practices. Also effective strategies to support and promote high quality education for dual language learners and their families, specifically dual language learners using data informed practices in professional development. Thinking about strategies to promote age appropriate digital literacy and supporting administration and other school leaders to understand and support quality early childhood settings, as well as effective strategies to support teachers, students, and families experiencing trauma. Lori, next slide, please.
Okay.
On pages 16 and 17, we talk a lot about curricular opportunities as well as dual language learners. So meeting the developmental need from young children, of young children is an important part of long-term success. ESSA relief funds can be used to expand curricular opportunities for children from birth through the early grades, as well as building a coordinated strategy for programming for dual language learners. I wanted to highlight these two key areas of the guidance document because these strategies are all aimed towards building systems that can take influx of funds on the front end, but do not need as much as they progress to maintain. So really great to invest in right off the bat. So some strategies include nutrition education. Thinking about childhood obesity has been a focus of many new school lunch menus and policies. Interactive technology, thinking about interactive websites, enriching apps, collaborative resources such as digital books, building out dual language learning and transitional bilingual education programs. These programs should promote bilingualism and biliteracy. Thinking about a dual language library, coordinated enrollment, thinking more of giving it a complete overhaul to be really family serving versus the program administration approach, just really supporting families, curricular supports. Teams of teachers can be given time to create authentic lessons and assessments based on background knowledge and languages of their students. Technological resources to enhance curriculum and additional support for teachers of dual language learners. And take-home supports, thinking about how to promote literacy and critical thinking, math, creativity, social emotional supports for parents and children together to support parent involvement. And last slide, please, Lori. And our last slide is really thinking about what are the policy implications when we're looking at this guidance document. So early childhood experiences have a great impact on long-term outcomes. Ensuring children have a strong foundation that can support them throughout their educational careers can help school districts and states avoid expensive remediation and retention and contribute to significantly better outcomes for children. Ideally, this guidance document could be used to reallocate funding to support best practices. Investment in our youngest learners will show a greater impact. Importantly, much of this discretion on how to spend these funds rests at the district level. Although state leaders may want to provide, if we think about how state leaders can support, you may want to think about how they can provide incentives, guidance, technical assistance, monitoring guidelines, all to promote early learning at a local level and improve coordination and alignment between and across programs and schools. Districts can also be thoughtful about how they consider these options, especially when they're, and I want to be really sensitive to what districts are going through, especially when they're given so many other possible uses for these funds. So as districts begin to plan for investments in early childhood, you may want to assess what you currently have in place, and in working with your families and other community partners and stakeholders, come together to identify the gaps. The early learning community, this is the choir. You should be prepared to work with your school boards and district leadership and state leadership to help make the case for these expenditures and to support the district in implementing early learning effectively and with equity at the center of your decision-making. This document ultimately offers guidance for districts to not only strengthen early learning experiences, but to sustain the same level of quality throughout the preschool to third grade, or even earlier, birth to third grade continuum. When considering how to move forward, districts should take into account how each of these strategies that we offer in this guidance document might contribute to an aligned system of supports for children and families, thinking about services and academically for holistic supports for children across the early years and grades. And again, districts should also consider the equity implications of the different policy choices in each of the areas. Thank you, and I'll add this link to the chat.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline, for sharing really a lot of fantastic information. We have next Richard, who's going to talk to us about the decision-making process and approach that the Michigan Department of Education and the Office of Great Start is taking and planning for the use of these funds. And the Office of Great Start actually includes both the pre-K program as well as childcare, home visiting, early intervention. So it's a really great example. Richard and the other directors and teams there in the Office of Great Start have worked for many years in a very coordinated way. So I'll turn it to your first slide. I will just make a comment on, hi Barb, who shared a comment about the tribal childcare, and often that there is a challenge in the connection, transition, and comfort level of going from early childhood to education, and that happens over time. We can chat more about that a little bit later.
Well, thank you, Lori, and also thank you, Barb, for bringing up tribal education as well, because our tribes in Michigan are part of our state preschool system as part of our providers eligible, and we do have a couple of the tribes, federally recognized tribes, as part of our provider system. So it's very exciting you brought that up. Thank you. Richard Lauer, I'm Director of Preschool and Out-of-School Time Learning at the Department of Education, and happy to be with you here today. I am here to speak a little bit about Michigan's journey as it relates to our role in high-quality pre-K provision, and then how the opportunities from the federal government have allowed us to think creatively and expand over these next couple of years. We can go on to the next slide. So Michigan's journey actually started intentionally pre-pandemic in the fall of 2019. And
I can't hear Richard. Can you?
I'm sorry. I
Okay, there we
inadvertently-
go. You might have to go back about the journey began the fall of something.
Okay, sorry. I inadvertently tapped my space bar. So Michigan's journey actually intentionally started pre-pandemic in the fall of 19, when Michigan actually had an existing strategic education plan that had a vision for serving all eligible 4-year-olds in Michigan's public preschool program, the Great Start Readiness Program, as well as 3-year-olds by 2025, but no specific metrics associated with it. And so we went through an updating of the Michigan Strategic Education Plan starting in fall of 19 and finished it in August of 2020. And one of the major upgrades to the Strategic Education Plan under our State Superintendent, Michael Rice, was specific metrics. And the metrics added beyond refining goals, because now we have 8, and goal number 1, as you can see, is expanding early learning opportunities. It's a living document. And the very first metric to that is the number and percent of state preschool children served. And a related metric is related to quality, or linking to the near benchmarks. But what's important is that we have identified metrics to our goals, and that it's overall linked to a vision for Michigan that it sets for not only the state, but for locals to contribute to. And as you'll see later, but also right now, our state superintendent, Dr. Michael Rice, sees GSRP's expansion as he terms it, a gift that keeps on giving throughout a child's life, both academically and as a whole child, a whole person. It's something you invest in now, and it continues to reap rewards all through the child's early childhood, middle childhood, late adolescence, young adulthood, etc. We all know this as a world of early childhood. Then, as you go on to the next slide, we have the opportunity of laying the foundation through strategic goal alignment. And then came the pandemic. We had to think creatively, how about we provide our state preschool program in modified format through flexibilities. And then we thought in the fall of 20 came CRRSA. And then in March of 21, ARPA. And with those two federal pieces of legislation came the ESSA funds. ESSER funds, the elementary and secondary supplemental education relief funds. Does not roll off the tongue very easily. But the ESSER funds, ESSER $2 and $3, massive funds. And as again, ESSER $2 were a tremendous boost in funding to schools, 90% going to districts, 10% state discretion. But then ESSER 3 in March were 4 times that. It was like ESSER on steroids. Tons of money coming. And what could we do? So yes, thinking forward, and the fact that all of this money had multiple years that we could spend it on, And with an additional 12 months of, federal tidings allowance, it all can be spent through September 30th of 2024. We have great opportunity here to think creatively, intentionally, and systemically on how state preschool could then, build and connect with childcare money. That's also within all of these federal laws, the new Head Start money. And then what I like to think about is all the other bunches of money that support families, all the nutrition money, the technology access money, the WIC money, the health money, the stuff that's in the USDA budgets, etc. So what we did in the department, as you can see on the May of 2021, is the MDE called for districts to consider using the ARPA funds because there were so much money in that Carissa dollar, and then the ARPA money. And we wanted to expand quality pre-K in Michigan, utilizing that. So we started drumbeating out of the Department of Ed, put out that memo that you see there as a link. We identified the key quality elements of what quality pre-K is. Of course, those aligned with our GSRP model and it aligned with the near benchmarks. And then how, of course, if local districts, because we're all local control except for a few outliers in this country, but how if you're going to be doing quality pre-K, you might as well just set yourself up for a few years down the road and implement the GSRP model, because you're going to be aligned to be then in a good position to be a grantee for GSRP. So in the meantime, what you'll see is in June of 2021, the governor of Michigan put out her renewed proposal. She ran on a universal pre-K platform, but she put out a renewed proposal. And I just put a quote in there from that proposal and press release in the chat. Ultimately, that renewed her vision and proposal about expanding GSRP to all eligible remaining children for GSRP. Now, in Michigan, GSRP children are eligible at 250% of the federal poverty level. And based on our census population estimates, that's about 22,000 more children. Currently, GSRP serves about 37,100 kids, and there are, just for some reference, and there's another 22,000 eligible. Michigan's birth cohort for 4-year-olds is roughly about 114,000. So then what you'll see is the final accomplishment. We have an annual budget cycle in Michigan. And GSRP is a categorical budget item that lives in that cycle. So we actively talk about GSRP on an annual basis. We educate on it, the legislature, the administration, the department. We talk about GSRP every year. And given all of this focus, the legislature, administration, and the department made it a priority. And that's what the last document is about on this page. The debate was not about should we fund and invest more money in GSRP or not. It was about how much. And that is an amazing spot. And the idea was ultimately using ARP funding in fiscal year 22 right up front, and then phase in over 3 years, with every subsequent year adding in a big chunk of state funding to replace federal funding, so that ultimately by the 4th year, the state picks up all the federal funding that that was put in upfront here in fiscal year 22. It's a typical kind of federal mentality of the phase out approach of federal dollars. And that is what we're doing here in Michigan. Ultimately, we're sitting currently at baseline at $249 million in Michigan in state funds to serve those 37,140 kids. And by the end of this, our goal is $418 million in state funds to serve the 22,000 more plus the 37,140. An extra bonus in all of this is that the administration and the legislature, legislative leaders, not only the governor, but Senator Thomas, Representative Albert, they agreed that we're going to do funding parity as well at the same time. they increased the per child amount for state pre-K since first time since 2013 to $8,700 per child, up from $7,250, and it matches the base foundation allowance of the K-12 system. So this is very exciting. If you go on to the next slide, Michigan went through a similar expansion back under Governor Snyder back in 2013 to 15 years. And that, so that's some of the information I just gave you, just so you have it in front of you to give you a sense of that. But Michigan went through a considerable expansion of $130 million back in years of 13 through 15. And it was important to understand that the role of private providers, or what we term community-based organizations, is vital to our system. You can go on to the next page. Now, Michigan has always had a mixed delivery system of providers since 1985. Funding source limited the extent to which we could bring CBOs into our partners. So the fact that underscoring our philosophy of mixed delivery of broad provider types in state preschool is not an issue for us. It is something that's jointly shared by, it's a nonpartisan issue. We understand the value, and it's very broad. It's public, private, for-profit, non-private, faith-based, across the board. It's a very broad definition of who can be providers in Michigan. Since these are public funds and school funds, they flow through intermediate school districts, and then they get subcontracted out. So from my point of view, the first expansion, the legislature created great flexibility, but they also set a minimum parameter, as you can see here, of 30% of the funding going to those CBOs. This helped not only drive some of the, to alleviate some of the whole concept of destabilizing the private childcare industry, since FORS, childcare payments for FORS kind of alleviates some of that cost burdens on the infant toddler care. So we all get all that from the early child perspective. So given the fact that, funneling funds to the private childcare industry to bring them in to be a partner of state pre-K, this was one strategy to help stabilize and alleviate some of those fears. And it's been exciting, and it's been a partnership, and we're excited to take it beyond that at this point. And so that is one of the things I wanted to touch base on about the partnerships. The other thing is that we've also enshrined in our law a GSRP Head Start blend option that defines a half amount of that, now $8,700 in federal funding, to pair with the federal appropriation for every child. And then all the services of both are combined for those duly eligible children. And so we have that option to bring the Head Start providers into our system more. And currently they provide service to almost 18% of our kids served in Michigan. So, and then we think about the other aspects of how we grade and couple with our friendly other federal programs. We couple with CCDF subsidy, as well as IDA Part B619, preschool special ed. So the wraparound, the bringing in of auxiliary special ed services, all of these state and federal funding sources are there to meet the children's needs and the family's needs. And ultimately, this helps to stabilize the different programs and pots of money and maximize the uses of them. And that's how we've been working. And this opportunity with ARPA only accelerates that. So what I would say is MDE indicates often that a small provider can start with one classroom or a portion of a classroom, because they can blend and braid different types of funding within a classroom. And that ultimately, we promote and underscore the importance of a mixed delivery system to meet parent need, to ensure that children are served in their communities by the providers that reflect the children and the families in the community. And so this is our little bit of a story, and we're excited to see where it goes in the next 2 to 3 years. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you, Richard, very much. Richard really told a fantastic story about a lot of stars being aligned. I know there's something coming up on the screen, and I really don't know exactly why, but I don't want it to take away from both what Jacqueline shared about the specific strategies that states could invest in, and then the story of how Michigan has used their goals and their metrics to really, target their investments to build capacity, not only for serving young children, but building out the system. So we're going to go to a poll because we are very interested in hearing what your state's top 3 priorities are. I'm going to launch it, and I'm going to allow the panelists to vote if you would like as well. So just choose 3, and we should be able to see. I don't know what to do about this. I'll give us another minute or 2. So pre-K expansion is pretty high on the list here for people that joined this.
The poll does only allow you to choose 1, just so you know, Lori.
Oh, you're kidding me. All right, well, there's a lesson learned. Why did I choose? Okay, sorry about that. I'll have to improve my webinar skills. Who knew? All right, I'm going to end it in a couple secs since you can only choose 1, and it seems like pre-K expansion is a big topic. Workforce compensation. I didn't see if anything's written in the chat box, but if something else is really a high priority, teacher or administrator professional development, I have heard from some other states. So end the poll, and we can share the results. All righty, so I'm going to resume sharing, and we are now going to turn to Mandy, who is going to provide you with some highlights of the publication, ideas, and inspiration for targeting American Rescue Plan funds to early care and education. Mandy?
Thanks, Lori, and thanks to our panelists today and for everyone who's joined us. I'm going to do a brief overview, as Lori mentioned, of the paper that came out recently from NEAR, CCSSO, and AECS SDE around ideas really for targeting the ARP funds to early childhood. So we'll put the link to the guide in the chat box, but we wanted to just give you a brief overview of what's in there. So it starts out with really talking about the funding explanation, which includes the fact that this is, of course, short-term funds, and we understand that for state leaders, that means we have to be strategic about how we invest them. Richard gave a great example of how state funds will then be increased to backfill, but for states who don't have that option, we know that there are options to use the funds that don't require long-term funding. So we'll be talking a little bit about that. So in the paper, we talk about the requirements, and then we talk about principles for really wisely investing those short-term dollars in early education. And then we go into a little bit about the evidence base for investing in early childhood education, which can be used, you all as state leaders can use that, district leaders can use that when trying to use funds for early childhood to show this is the research base, this is the evidence base of why we should invest these funds this way. And then lastly, we go into many state examples in the paper, so feel free to look through, but I'm gonna go through just a couple today here so you all can hear those. So we can go to the next slide. So some state examples, we talk in the paper about the importance and the requirements around stakeholder engagement at the state and local level. So just wanted to highlight one key stakeholder engagement example that you'll find links and information on in the paper, and that's the Indiana Department of Education example. So they have identified their 4 priorities around their ESSER funds, and then from there, they've created these wiki pages, which allows district leaders to really go in and share these creative ideas across the state. And allows district leaders who need ideas to go in and then read those, adapt them, and then hopefully connect with other district leaders to see how they could use those across the state. We also have an example from Pennsylvania around research and data. So again, you're maybe needing evidence-based for using or these funds for early childhood. So Pennsylvania has this evidence resource center by topic, where you can search for evidence-based programs that you can use the funding on. There's a lot of filters in there, which makes it easy to navigate around if you want social emotional learning, but you want particular tiers of that, or if you want focus on social emotional learning for children with special needs or children who are English language learners, you can kind of use the filters in there to do that. It's a really great resource for other states as well. Talking about the summer transition, I know there was a question in the chat around trying to hand off robust data from Head Start, pre-K, other early. Okay, we're back, I think. I think we'll get the slides back up in a minute, but I'll continue to talk about the Hawaii program while we get those back up. So this is a program that already existed in Hawaii, but now they are going to they have funded it for all districts that they can use this summer start kindergarten transition program. And it's a 3-week program that allows children who have had no early childhood experience to have almost an orientation to what school is like, an orientation to what it means to be in a classroom and what it means to work with a K-12 teacher. And so this program is now going to be available to all the districts using these funds. So that's another idea, is really to build on something that you know already works in your state, and to kind of build it up and make it available for others through these funds, through this one-time funding. So for summer instruction, obviously we're in July. So these are kind of some things that you can look back on that we had in the paper, and it was timely when it came out, around summer programming. And just one thing to highlight here is just what has worked in your state in the summer. How can you adapt that for the school year in after school programming and tutoring programming? So a couple examples are listed here from 3 different states that really look at ways to do evidence-based summer programming. Next slide, please. So next we'll go into state examples of planning guides for districts. So the first example is around Louisiana. Louisiana has an early childhood planning guidance for stakeholders to really maximize the use of the federal funding to support their early childhood system. So what's important to note here is that Louisiana has a unique example of requiring early childhood leaders to work together with K-12 leaders collaboratively. They move their planning due dates and requirements so that it is a requirement that they work together. And so again, for the point in the chat box, this will really help kind of with that handoff, because if you have these requirements in place and the timelines in place, then it'll help district leaders and then teachers at the classroom level to really understand why this handoff of data is so important and why just planning together in general is so important. So check out that guide from Louisiana. The next example from the paper is Kansas. They're using this Navigating Next plan as their guidance to school leaders. And it really encourages that collaborative team feel from across health, teaching, families, and all to kind of support the implementation of the district plan. So there's a link to that as well. The Illinois example from their Learning Renewal Resource Guide is a great one because it really goes K through 20. So you have all the way from pre-K through college age students really in one plan to move forward. It's really robust. It's about 184 pages. So you can take pieces of it that work for your state to help your districts and put that together. But it really focuses on all the domains: academic, social, emotional, mental health. It's a really robust example if you want to check that one out. And then the last one we have here is the Washington Planning Guide as an example. That is really, it's a great example because they are challenging districts to conduct an equity analysis. So this is a way for districts to really take a look at those numbers and see how they can use this one-time federal funding to increase equity in their state. Next slide, please. So the last thing we just want to highlight are just some general ideas that kind of came out of the paper for state leaders. So for state leaders, lifting up some great local examples around school community partnerships, knowing that addressing learning loss / unfinished learning is so important with these funds, finding ways to lift that up to the state level, and then hopefully share that with other districts so that other districts can replicate or can adapt for themselves. Another example, this has come up a lot, and I'm sure it'll probably come up in Mario's presentation, around how these funds really flow, and thinking about Title I and thinking about pre-K and how your state already uses Title I for pre-K or maybe doesn't, how you can look at quality through that lens, and just in general, thinking about just funds and how they flow when we have such a one-time funding surplus. And then we also had a link here for, of course, the state plans that are already up on the USED website. So when you get these slides, you can have a chance to look at those and maybe gather some ideas from those. And I think that's all we had. We will have, I think it might already be in the chat box, the link. If not, I'll put it in there, the link to our paper. And I'll turn it back to you, Lori.
Thank you so much, Mandy. The paper is really chock full of both some guidance and some frameworks around how to think about investing these funds in a way that accounts for the fact of the short-term nature, but allows you to build out your system, some immediate investments, some longer-term investments, and then lots and lots of amazing work that's happened across the country. Particularly those district guides, I think are really, really helpful. So I'm very excited now. Again, that gave you lots of ideas and inspiration, and I know Miriam will as well. Miriam has really been only at the department for, I dare say, a couple of weeks, and kind of getting reconnected with various folks and really trying to elevate now early learning at the department and provide kind of a focal point for the work on birth to third grade at the department. So I'll turn it over to you, Miriam.
Great, thank you so much, Lori. Can everyone can you hear me okay? Hear me okay? Great, thanks. Well, I want to thank NEAR and CCSSO and the National Association of Early Childhood Specialists and State Departments of Education for including me today in this webinar, my fellow co-presenters for all the critical work you've done the past 16 months and all that you continue to do for children and families in your states and your communities, and all of the contributors to this important publication, and all the publications really looking at, in particular, the funds for the K-12 system, and looking at and putting out this, I think, really important information about how these resources and ARP and ESSER funds can be used for early childhood. I think it's a really, really important issue to get and to stimulate conversation in our field. So we know that there is a lot of flexibility in the use of ARP and ESSER funds, really to respond to the needs of schools, students, families, particularly those most impacted by the pandemic, and including flexibility to use these funds in early childhood. You know, when I look both across the really historic and unprecedented amounts that are coming into to support the response and support for schools to the pandemic, combined with really historic funds coming to early childhood through some of the dedicated funding streams in early childhood, IDEA, Part C and B combined to $450 million in ARP, $1 billion for Head Start, $39 billion in childcare. I think it was Mandy that was talking about the resource are just critically important and I think incredibly key in this moment to really be able to think across these various funding streams, which is, so much of what we do in early childhood, and I think especially important at this moment. And so I think there's great examples in these resources. At the department, we're really, with respect to ARP and ESSER and within early learning, integrating this work, really doing a lot to, I think, first and foremost, really to listen to communities, highlight best practices around use of funds. So working with states and districts, providing technical assistance, facilitating communities of practice. So we have a summer learning collaborative, different resources that we're putting out about uses of funds, again, lifting up best practices through webinars and other resources and technical assistance documents where we can, point to different strategies and the ways funds are being used. I would invite everybody to look at if you haven't already, the Best Practices Clearinghouse. That is really documenting work that's been happening, I think, this summer to get ready and to push, making a strong push, obviously, towards a return to in-person learning in the fall and going back to school, including early learning in that. So we're definitely still looking at resources and would love to be able to include more resources and best practices for early learning, including some of what was highlighted in the publication and what we heard today. Since I have begun at the department, have been also spending a lot of time in work and building a strong coordination and collaboration with the Department of Health and Human Services, both in a lot of the activities around the pandemic response, highlighting best practices, and in particular, thinking about the American Families Plan, because I think this is, as we've thought about here, there's historic investments happening right now in early childhood and in public education, and this administration and this president is committed to thinking about how we build for the long term and these investments, and understanding that it is not adequate and sufficient enough to go back to the system that we had pre-pandemic, right? That we need to do a lot more in early childhood to build a more equitable early learning system in states and communities. And so a great deal of work has really been spent in my first, in the early part of my tenure now at the department, really on building support for the American Families Plan, which would bring $425 billion as a new investment in childcare and preschool access, and building a more equitable early learning system. So that is incredibly exciting, as well as really being able to sustain a lot of other funding in the child tax credit and a lot of other critical investments, paid leave for families, investments in the workforce, investments in our educators and higher education, free community college. So I will put a link in the chat, again, to our Best Practices Clearinghouse and the American Families Plan. So you can get more information about that. But again, the American Families Plan is not a foregone conclusion. It is a proposal and a priority for our administration, but it is a way, I think, to think about and build from, thinking about long-term, how do we make this transition and continue to build from an early learning system. The department has also proposed and has the support of the president to be able to continue to invest more Title I resources into high need schools and communities, including calling for greater investments in preschool education, investments in the workforce, investments So we do see, and I expect to see, a continued growing emphasis at the department in building more capacity in early learning. And that's, I think, kind of the final point I wanted to touch on. And Laura asked me to speak a little bit to this is, sort of the vision kind of in the department. And I'll say that I am the third person to be in this role, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Early Learning at the Department of Education. I have two predecessors, many of you will remember, Jacqueline Jones and Libby Doggett, two really incredible leaders that served in the Obama administration in this position. This is, I think, an incredible moment for our field. And I really look at this as an opportunity, and I'm honored to be coming back in at this moment and building really more capacity at the department. I think there are just so many equities in the department. Already so many existing investments with allowable uses of early learning. So much that with our investments in higher education that currently exist, as well as so much more that can be built with these new opportunities we have ahead of us with the American Families Plan, the current the ARP funds, as well as our growing budget requests. So I'm really excited to really focus on building from where we were in the Obama administration, really in the department, coordinating really internally to build a focus on the workforce, driving, I think, equity, a number of our funding streams. Really, the reason for the existence of the Department of Education really is to support equity and advance opportunities for underserved, under-resourced students, students who attend under-resourced schools and who have been historically underserved in our public education system. And early learning is absolutely critical to that strategy. So, and then again, really reestablishing that strong partnership with HHS and doing this in a way so that this is sustainable. I think that there was not, unfortunately, a lot that was continued through the previous administration in terms of policy coordination between ED and HHS at a high level, although a lot of collaboration and work that continued among civil servants and across programs. But I know that as somebody that just came from a state and as a state leader, that we need really intentional and focused policy coordination and collaboration. And I know that there's a commitment both at HHS and within ED to go back to that, to lift that up, to build that in a way that we can sustain that, and to have a more coordinated strategy internally on early learning at ED and to build that capacity. So those are some of my goals kind of coming in. And again, thank you for the opportunity and for all the great work you're doing. I am eager to listen to the rest of this conversation and learn more about what's happening in the field. And so I will hand it back over, I think, to you, Lori, and I look forward to staying on for as long as I can to hear more about what's happening.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Miriam. I mean, it's so important for us to have you there with your experience and your just willingness to really kind of take on this challenge. So I said to you when we did the prep call, we're all behind you and we're all here to help you. So I'm going to turn it over to Rolf, who's going to kind of summarize the key points from our talk, each of the presentations. Please go ahead and submit. Everybody seems to be using the chat box or Q&A, but any questions you have specifically for anybody, any of the presenters, share resources. We really want to, hear from you. Any innovations, any challenges. So I'll turn it over to Rolf.
Okay, thank you, Lori, and thank you everybody for joining this wonderful webinar. I think we are getting a lot of good information about some of the opportunities that we have with the additional funding. I think there are some key principles that work with this particular funding is that I think it's been said many times that this particular funding is linked to the recovery of all the impact that the pandemic had on our children in the public school system as well as in childcare. And so the direct link to any of these activities that are being proposed by the states or by the local districts really need some kind of rationale as to how it connects to addressing the impact of the pandemic. But I think what Miriam said, it is flexible money. That is, means that a lot of the restrictions with federal funds are being waived at this point for the short-term funding that is available. And there's an opportunity here to really address some of the systemic gaps that we have seen before the pandemic that have been exposed. And I think we have an opportunity to really address them here. And I think what Jocelyn laid out in this report, which I think has only given us some sections of it, I think are really wonderful ideas that are related to what the field is looking for, that needs to be addressed across the board, not just in some, areas in particular districts or in some regions, but across the board for all our children across the country. And I think what has been raised is that the territories are included as well the tribal communities. And I think that has really been stressed in terms of the funding has been included. And I think we can't really have to really be more exclusive about the use of the funds in reaching everybody. That does include, and what was included in Jocelyn's report was the funding being used for children with disabilities. I think this is probably the group of children that has been impacted the most. Those adequate services for those children that had IEPs or IFSPs has probably not been up to the standard that we typically expect. And I think that is an area that needs to be looked at in terms of ways and how we can support the families and their children in just addressing their particular needs. That, of course, is across the board. There are social and emotional needs, mental health needs, and of course, the family engagement is very critical in that aspect. And that has all been laid out in the report that we've seen from the Foresight Law Policy and the Center for Study of Education Policy, the Education Council, which has already issued some paper with other organizations and how the fund can be used, especially for childcare, and the Erickson Institute. What I really liked about that was the use of existing appropriated funds in Title I and Title IV, as well as in Title II. I think what we really have, what we should look for is that local districts now, as they put in the plans to states, is to see how the existing funding streams are going to be enhanced with the federal funds that have less restrictions as the original appropriated funds that exist for K-12. And I think there is an opportunity to do address the compensation issues in early childhood education through various means in supporting preschool, Head Start, and of course our early childhood programs. I like the idea that Miriam is really looking for another reconnecting with HHS. I think this is so important. We haven't seen that for the last 4 years at the higher level. I think there is funding available for childcare. There's funding available for public schools and for early learning within the public schools. And I think the overlap that we see is in pre-kindergarten. I think we heard from Richard, just I was working out a 30% appropriation of the pre-kindergarten funds in Michigan for CBOs, for community-based organizations. That is a big goal. That is quite challenging and ambitious, but I think with the funding sources that come through childcare, the funding sources that come through the K-12 system, I think this is the opportunity to address that. And parity in terms of compensation is one area. The workforce development is one area. We have seen a lot of people in childcare leaving the field. And so I think there is, and that same is true for K-12 and for our pre-kindergarten classrooms. Teachers have left, and then there's a recruitment process underway to bring teachers back into the field. I think there is a lot of damage that the pandemic had caused that need to be addressed, and that's what the funding should be for. I think the aspect of the transition, I wanted to emphasize that in a way, because the council had produced a document on the coordination requirement that was several years ago. That was in the context of the ESSA plans that were developed by the states. And adding the link to that document. And I think it might be worthwhile looking back into that if those kind of coordination requirements for the transition purposes between early childhood education and maybe if you say K-3 could be established, still a valid document. Then, of course, we have worked with NEAR and with the National Association of Early Childhood Specialists, the Departments of Education, the plans as they emerged and were posted. We're working right now and looking at all the 33 plans, what has been done in terms of supporting early learning. And I think there are several states that stand out, and then there's some states that have very little in that regard. But Louisiana, we already talked about that as a very strong emphasis on early learning. So does Michigan. And then we also have seen it in Utah, and a strong emphasis on early learning and early literacy. So there are a number of resources that have come out over the last few months that have similar kind of suggestions in terms of how the funding can be used and how it connects with the impact of the pandemic and how it can be related. We have heard from legal advisors that even the use of repairs and renovations is possible as long as it's related to creating a safe and a healthy learning environment in schools. And that applies to early learning centers as well as to schools. So there are a number of questions that have come in, and there is a question that I think maybe for Miriam might be able to sort of talk about that in more detail. The department is now receiving all its plans, as I mentioned, and now the states are looking for local districts to submit their plans. So one question was about just how they are in sync. In other words, how is a state plan that is submitted and approved by the Department of Ed, how is that going to line up with the efforts that are done in states with several hundred school districts that are submitting their plans? What would the state role be in supporting the districts so that their overall vision of what is going to be in place would then actually find its way into the schools and into the classrooms, or in the support systems for families and for children? Miriam, you want to talk about that?
Sorry about that, Rolf. I was having a little bit of a connectivity issue there. Can you briefly synthesize that question again for me?
Sure, no problem. So there's a question that came in about that the state plans have now been submitted and will be approved by the department.
Mm-hmm.
Then in turn, the local districts are developing their plans, already working
Right.
on that, and they are submitting it to the states. So what could be the state role in sort of helping districts to stay within the vision of the state plans? It's basically just sort of an alignment issue in terms of making sure that there's some overall cohesiveness in the way and how those issues of unfinished learning and summer planning and so on and so forth is being addressed.
Yeah, that is a great question. I am not as I don't want to give a wrong answer to that question, given that I'm not as intimately involved in working on the ARP ESSER FAQs and implementation questions, but I can get an answer back to that. I can get an answer to that question. Would that be helpful, or would there be a way to get that back? Yeah.
Yeah, it might be helpful. And then I think some of this
Okay.
might be playing out at the state level in terms of how that works, and maybe something to look at as to how the state is now working with districts in terms of
Yes.
Maybe Richard could comment about how they're doing this in Michigan, just as an example. But it would be great, Miriam. Any follow-up we can send later.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I was just going to offer up anyway. I was one of the authors of the state plan for Michigan. because of my summer learning and school time work. So I authored the before after summer learning portions of the plan and then connected it to several others. So then I got the preliminary feedback as well. So one of the, a couple of the questions back were explicitly, how does the state intend to do exactly what you said, Rolf? How does the state intend to support local districts in the different areas, remediation and summer learning, and the professional development, in achieving the outcomes of what you said you were going to do as the state in these different areas of use of ARPA funds or ESSER 3 funds. And so we as a state had to write specifically what we would be doing in terms of field consultation, technical assistance, what we would be utilizing as raising, what methods we would be utilizing as raising awareness to the various research and evidence-based assessments, and training tools that would improve literacy, that would improve outcomes of students, and then how would we actually be measuring the outcomes as well. So for the various areas that the application addressed within the goals and the required set-asides, et cetera, we as a state had to specifically indicate how we were going to support our local districts. And we have, about 800 in Michigan in terms of local districts, including school academies, how we would be doing that. And through our network of training and technical assistance and field supports, et cetera. And the fact that we, and that's just traditional K-12. And then we add this whole component of pre-K as well to it, and early childhood. So that is, when you get the additional question officially as a response from USAID, it'd be great to support. But in terms of, the districts had to submit their plans in our grant system, tell us how they were going to use it. And then we had, we put that in our plan, and then how we were going to support the districts in doing what they said they were going to accomplish.
Yeah, that's right. There is a section in the template that calls for the state support to districts. That's
Yes.
great. There's a question that came in from Mandy. Mandy, you're working with all the early childhood specialists across the country, and the question is really about what have you heard from the specialists in terms of their involvement in writing the plan, or at least being involved in some fashion internally within the agency to support the writing of the plan. Have you
Yeah.
heard from states as to how that's playing out?
Yeah, so kind of a mixed bag. There are some states where doors are unfortunately a little more closed than others, depending on just because of the way the funds flow. So that's why I said concentrate on, it's coming through Title I offices. And so what's your relationship with your Title I office is really important. It's particularly if you're going to try to use for pre-K, like the example in Michigan and some other states. But there are a lot of states where there's been a lot of success just based on past guidance, especially during COVID, and having that EC voice at the table. So there have been success stories as well that I've heard from states. So I think it really depends, but I think using some of the examples from the papers that we shared today, and then of course, guidance that's going to forthcoming from the federal level, I think will really help as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then a final question came that I have, at least at this point, for Jaslyn, because the original plan for the report was for Illinois, and then it sort of became something bigger and is now being shared nationally. Jaslyn, can you talk a little bit about how that document is making its way to the field, and how is it being received, and how is it being used? Have you gotten some feedback on that at this point?
Sure, and I apologize. I'm having some connectivity issues, and I think
That's why my screen is off, but hopefully can everyone, I hope you can hear me. Yes,
We
this
can.
originally, we're good?
Yeah, we're good.
Thank you. Originally, yes, it was, we brought this to the table back in 2017. And due to, with ARP and the landscape currently, many of the recommendations still hold true. So we brought it back with an advisory committee once again to see if there's anything new and how we can adjust it for a national conversation. So that's where it was, brought back to the Illinois State Board of Education, many other entities across the state to say, hey, is this something that, what we've been hearing from other advocates is that it is something that's been very useful. Again, we just released this within the past few weeks. And so far we've had some really great, responses in wanting to, in having this as a guidance document. Again, like I had said earlier, this is a very unique time where we have to be sensitive to what is happening in many different levels. There's so many different players around each table that want to use this funding. And that's why I think it's extremely important for the early childhood advocates out there to, help to educate around the importance of these dollars with younger learners to have a piece of that and be able to use it. So, while this is a guidance document, it's also meant to hopefully help to raise the level of conversation so that it is helping in this time where so many different people want to use this funds in different places. And granted, it will need to be used in different places, but hopefully these recommendations can support moving forward for many.
Mhm. Thank you. A couple comments. Miriam mentioned that the flexibility is great at the state level to provide flexibility for local districts, and that there's minimum requirements that are provided by the Department of Ed. And Bridget gave us a link to some documents out of this department, but you also had a comment. Do you want to speak to that quickly, and then we can turn it over to Lori?
Which comment? The one
The
about,
one that came up in the chat box about you had that one aspect of Michigan's plan development.
the last one.
Quarterback.
Yeah. So, yeah, because there's somewhat to Mandy's point about the title office, where Michigan's state plan for ARPA was actually, led by the superintendent's office, executive staff, and they coordinated across all departments and offices at the Department of Education. This actually ensured, and then all of it was kept within the lens of our state strategic education plan, so that ultimately, even though, like I said, I was one of the authors around summer learning and before and after, but other offices that had vested interest in that in terms of curriculum instruction and career tech ed and so forth, they had eyes on it as well as health and nutrition, and then vice versa. The social emotional learning aspects, now health area, school nutrition, I had eyes on that along with staff and so forth. And so there were leads, but again, all of this was coordinated out of the SOUP's office instead of a particular, because although it followed title formula, for 90% going, these aren't title funds necessarily. These are ARPA funds. These are ESSER funds. And we had to keep that in mind. And that's where Miriam's point about the flexibilities are actually greater than what we would normally be having within the concept. And so we had to keep that in mind also, because we kept that thinking title formula, but it's not title funds.
That's a very good point. And Rolf, thank you so much for summarizing kind of what we heard today and then some of the ongoing questions. I mean, we know that there are challenges. It's amazing the amount of dollars that are going into early childhood, but it is also very difficult for state governments to get these dollars out. Richard you mentioned much earlier about what kind of metrics and accountability would you have for the dollars, and then setting up these different systems. So I think that we heard some fantastic examples of Michigan where preparation met opportunity. They had a strong strategic plan, which was focused on early learning. They had a lot of lineups of leaders that were all focused around early childhood. That's happening in many other states across the country, but not all. So we also know that other state specialists need a lot of support to elevate and advocate for the importance of investing in young children. We are here to help and support. So I'm going to do one more poll because we're kind of interested in hearing what resources or learning experiences would help you use federal relief funds wisely. So I'm going to launch this poll, and then I'll have a concluding slide. All of this information will be posted on NEAR's website under our COVID-19. Hold on one second. Let me just get to poll 2. All right. I'm going to do that while all of these resources will be posted on NEAR's website under COVID-19. But we would be interested in hearing what's most helpful to you. This is kind of the start of the journey, and even though it's just a couple years with using these funds, the degree to which we can demonstrate they're being used wisely, that we could inform them being used for young children on evidence-based practices, I think will really help Miriam and others who are trying to elevate and advocate for early childhood within the birth to grade 12 system, including with childcare. So I'll give it another minute and then I'll end the poll. Looks like an annotated resource list is one of the top numbers, and thankfully we started that. We're going to share that. If there's any resources you want us to put them in the chat box, we'll add it. We're going to be sharing that after. I think the next is more informal coffee hours, which Mandy's been doing for the specialists, so that would be terrific. And maybe more peer learning communities that are time limited, that might focus on specific aspect of the state plans and or district support, and then workshop sessions, which I imagine would happen. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling so you can see that. All righty. So we do have some selected resources. I put a couple here. Learning Policy Institute has a specific document on ECE. We did a series of blogs where we had Virginia, Louisiana, Maryland, South Carolina. We interviewed them and they talked about how they were thinking and planning for using it. You might take a look at that. That gets some great information. This is some questions by Ed Trust. And then this just came out this week, Learning Starts at Birth, which was a guide to estimating costs around educator residency and apprenticeship programs. That seems to be possibly a big source of investment using some of the federal dollars for. We will post a more complete resource list, so please do share that. But I want to first take the opportunity to thank our presenters. We know you are very, very busy. Richard and Miriam and Jacqueline. We really are grateful that you took the time to be with us today. We really appreciate hearing each of your perspectives. Thank you to my co-conspirators, I suppose, Mandy and Rolf. It's really a great collaboration of our individuals and our organizations. And we thank each of you for each of the work that you do every single day on behalf of young children. We hope to hear from you. and to hear about what you're doing and what you want to share with others, what you're proud of. So thank you so much, and we hope you have a fantastic rest of the day.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.